Muchas gracias por estar aquí, gracias Rosaura por recibirnos. Les voy a presentar a Qrescent Mali Mason. Ella es Assistant Professor en Filosofía en Haverford College y actualmente es la presidenta de la Sociedad Internacional Simone de Beauvoir. Ella tiene un PhD en Filosofía y un certificado en Women's Studies de la Universidad de Temple en 2014, en el cual escribió una tesis titulada Una disposición ética hacia lo erótico, los escritos tempranos autobiográficos de Simone de Beauvoir y la filosofía negra feminista, con la cual ella vincula los trabajos autobiográficos de Simone de Beauvoir de 1920 a 1940, los 20 y 40, con lo erótico en sus journals y memorias, así como con los el desarrollo de su pensamiento en la ética, y dibuja paralelismos con los escritos de las pensadoras feministas negras, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, acerca de lo erótico. De 2014 a 2018 trabajó en el Departamento de Estudios de Género y Mujeres en Berea College, donde ella solidificó su compromiso con el valor de la teoría, la manera de teorizar interdisciplinaria e interseccional a través de la enseñanza y la investigación de los estudios afroamericanos y de género y sexualidad. Además del existencialismo, la fenomenología, la filosofía feminista, la filosofía de la raza crítica y la filosofía política, social y ética. Entre sus más recientes trabajos están Black Girl Magic as Resistant Imaginary, publicado en Hipatia, We Feel Grateful and Alive to be Doing This Work Together, Phenomenological Reflections on a 2020 Summer of Feminist Research Across Difference, en Punta, y actualmente está trabajando en un libro sobre ambigüedad. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Gracias. So, hello, thank you so much for letting me be here. I apologize that I'm not speaking in Spanish. For some reason, when I came to Mexico, I feel like everything I learned about Spanish disappeared. So I'm going to talk about and think about sort of like barriers to coalition and solidarity. And part of that, or I'm thinking, part of that is language. So how we sort of translate and talk across language and cultural differences. So that's I think so I want to sort of begin by saying that as the introduction mentioned, I'm a philosophy professor from the United States, and I'm interested in Black feminist philosophy and existentialism and phenomenology. I came to Mexico City and to Mexico in general to work on a book about ambiguity. I've been having a hard time writing since I came here because there's a lot of energy, and it changed sort of my orientation to my writing. So one of the things that I hoped that is positive that came out of this is that I was able to be more embodied, more direct with my experience while I was here. So I also was able to have an ambassador and a teacher who was able to sort of help me kind of be a part of the culture or understand some parts of the culture. And so learning from her was so enlivening and important that now I'm kind of greedy. And so really, you think you're coming to learn from me, but I want to really learn from you. I want to use this as an opportunity, not only to talk about my work, but also to enact or act out some of the work that I'm interested in theoretically. And I'm interested in solidarity. I'm interested in coalition. I'm interested in how different feminisms can connect and how they're separate. So I'm going to just present to you a few of the lenses or sort of few of the frameworks that I'm using so we can think about it together. And then I'm going to focus on Audre Lorde. So I'm a Black feminist philosopher, Audre Lorde. And I'm going to talk about her work or a metaphor that I think is interesting or useful in her work of the weave or the pattern or the fabric. And I'm going to talk about how that metaphor, I think, is a way that we can connect Black feminisms with other women of color feminisms. So for instance, Latinx feminism. And so then I want to sort of think about how the connections and the differences are sort of weaved together in a fabric. So the first lens that I'm using, you'll see numero uno on the handout, is about Black feminism. So, would you finish? Oh, wait, maybe you can't see this on here. So we're gonna, there's no more. So we're gonna talk about Black feminism. There are 5 premises that I'm bringing from a woman named Beverly Guy Sheftall, a Black feminist named Beverly Guy Sheftall. And I'm just going to read this together to give people an opportunity to kind of translate or whatever, to sit with the words. So this is just a general description of Black feminism. So while Black feminism is not a monolithic, static ideology, and there is considerable diversity among African American feminists, certain premises are constant. One, that Black women experience a special kind of oppression and suffering in this country, in the United States, which is racist, sexist, and classist because of their dual racial and gender identity and their limited access to economic resources. 2, this triple jeopardy has meant that the problems, concerns, and needs of Black women are different in many ways from those of both white women and Black men. 3, Black women must struggle for Black liberation and gender equality simultaneously. 4, there is no inherent contradiction in the struggle to eradicate sexism and racism, as well as the other isms which plague the human community, such as classism and heterosexism. And 5, Black women's commitment to the liberation of Blacks and women is profoundly rooted in their lived experience. So looking at this quote, there are a few parts that I want to highlight. One is in number 1 on that, talking about dual racial and gender identity. So this idea of having sort of this dual identity to deal with. Also, number 3, the notion of struggling for Black liberation and gender equality simultaneously. So again, the simultaneous struggles of these two, both liberation for race and sexual or gender liberation at the same time. And then also in number 5, that there's a connection that, especially in Black feminism, the lived experience is the basis for the feminism. So the next framework that I'm using is the framework of intersectionality. And so Black feminism, sort of an aspect or one dynamic of Black feminism that I think the word is sort of a generalized term that talks about just what we were talking about, the simultaneity of the sort of gender and race, the differences and having to fight for all. So intersectionality becomes a sort of umbrella term for talking about all of this. And intersectionality stems from Kimberly Crenshaw. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who's writing Demarginalizing the Intersections. So this is the next quote, just to give some, I think sometimes people talk about intersectionality and don't read the actual text. And so this gives us an opportunity just to sit with the text for a second. So I'm just going to read this again and then we'll talk about it. So consider an analogy to traffic in an intersection, coming and going in all 4 directions. If an accident happens in an intersection, then it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them. Similarly, if a Black woman is harmed because she is in the intersection, her injury could result from sex discrimination or race discrimination. but it is not always easy to reconstruct an accident. Sometimes the skid marks and the injuries simply indicate that they occurred simultaneously, frustrating efforts to determine which driver caused the harm. So, and when I point to this quote from Kimberly Crenshaw's work, I'm again, obviously interested in the notion of simultaneity, how this traffic analogy shows us that these things can be happening at the same time, but at the site of the accident, we're thinking about an intersection, at the site of the accident, it's not necessarily clear which one of those factors contributed to the harm done in the middle, right? And also that the person being harmed in the middle feels the impact without necessarily knowing where the impact has come from. So that's sort of how I'm thinking or framing intersectionality. So I'm using Audre Lorde as an example of a Black feminist, so maybe late second wave, early third wave feminist. And she is big in the United States right now. I don't know how you can tell me sort of how she's being engaged here, but I am particularly interested in her as an example, and I'm using her as an example of a specific Black feminist to connect her to sort of Black feminism in general. And here in Audre Lorde, this quote from The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, number 3, I wanted to, she writes, because I am woman, because I am Black, because I am myself, a Black woman, warrior, poet doing my work, come to ask you, or I come to ask you, are you doing yours? Is her question. And so highlighting, I also want to highlight there, so, why I use this quote where she says, I'm Black, I'm myself a Black woman, warrior, poet. So one of the things that Audre Lorde is sort of known to do is to enumerate, to name the different aspects of her identity, to make it clear that all of these parts are a part of who I am and a part of what I understand is my work to do. So that's sort of the Black feminist lens, or one part that I'm trying to pull together. Another part that I'm interested in, it's connected to the notion of experience, is phenomenology. So I'm using here a framework that I received from a philosopher named Paget Henry. And so Paget Henry is interested in Africana phenomenology. So what does it mean to have a tradition of phenomenology that is separate from and or distinct from sort of European Western phenomenology, or what are sort of the differences and connections? So he initially writes about Africana, we're trying to think about Africana phenomenology. I think when did this in 2011? So maybe in 2 years prior, so 2009, he wrote about Africana phenomenology. He wrote an article about Africana phenomenology and tried to identify who are Black African-American phenomenologists. And he didn't name any women. So then, I guess 2 years later, he wants to write about gender and Africana phenomenology. And one of the reasons I bring him up is he gives us a framework for Africana phenomenology, but he thinks of gender as separate, right? So he thinks of like a gender phenomenology is separate from Africana phenomenology. But still useful, I'm using some of his premises. So this is number 4, I would just read it again. 4th, all of our major Africana phenomenologists share an interest in making explicit the deforming impact of racialization on the self and the consciousness of Africana peoples. 2nd, toward this end, they have developed systematic theories of the impact of racialization and how it can be overcome. 3rd, the above deformative impact of racialization serves as the primary occasion for the initiating process of phenomenological self-reflection, as opposed to the deformative impact of excessive instrumental rationalization in the case of Western phenomenology. 4th is the method of self-reflection. 5th, and finally, is the ethical/practical project of Africana phenomenology. So one of the things some of the things that he's identifying here that I want to highlight, number 4, the method of self-reflection. So a particular kind of, oh, that's fun. It's fine. Okay. All right. So a particular kind of the method of self-reflection. So I'm connecting self-reflection as different. I think he's trying to say it's a different kind of self-reflection than what we understand or what he would understand as the history of sort of European phenomenological self-reflection. Because it comes from the experience of racialization. And then the fifth part is that it has an interest in an ethical project. So it has an ethical or political project, whereas I think he would say that the sort of history of Western phenomenology understands itself more or less as apolitical. So these are two sort of parts of also Africana phenomenology that I'm bringing in. Again, with regard to phenomenology, so on the end of phenomenology, I'm also thinking about critical phenomenology. So critical phenomenology as a strain of phenomenology that is emerging and that is new, and they're trying to sort of think about the politics, how politics affect our ability to enter into the phenomenological project. So here is, let's see if you all can see this. Yeah, so here is a quote from a book about critical phenomenology. I'm gonna read again this. A critical phenomenology draws attention to the multiple ways in which power moves through our bodies and through our lives. It is also an ameliorative phenomenology, so a healing, a phenomenology that's interested in ameliorating, right, and healing. Phenomenology that seeks not only to describe, but also to repair the world, encouraging generativity, respect, and compassion for the diversity of our lived experiences. Such a project can never be an individual endeavor, moreover, but requires coalitional labor and solidarity across difference. So it's another, this critical phenomenology also has an interest and investment in ethical political project, similar to, I think, Africana phenomenology. And it also adds this thing about amelioration, about healing, about repair. So not just to describe, but also to change. And then another sort of part that I want to bring out is, again, this issue of coalitional labor and solidarity, that requires coalitional labor and solidarity. So as mentioned in the bio, I am the president of Simone de Beauvoir Society, and one other phenomenologist that I rely on very heavily is Simone de Beauvoir, and particularly her concept of ambiguity. So I'm writing this book about ambiguity, and it began with my thinking about ambiguity through Simone de Beauvoir, and this is an excerpt from the Ethics of Ambiguity. And I'm just gonna read through this. There's a lot of he here, which feels, very like the way that we critique Simone de Beauvoir. What are her gender politics? So when I have this quote with all these he's, I'm like, ugh, but we'll read it. So just because we're thinking about sort of the ambiguity. So a new paradox is thereby introduced into man's or human's destiny. Rational animal, thinking reed, he escapes from his natural condition without, however, freeing himself from it. He is still a part of this world of which he is a consciousness. He asserts himself as pure internality against which no external power can take hold. And he also experiences himself as a thing crushed by the dark weight of other things. At every moment, he can grasp the non-temporal truth of his existence. But between the past, which is no longer, and the future, which is not yet, this moment when he exists is nothing. This privilege, which he alone possesses, of being a sovereign and unique subject amidst a universe of objects, is what he shares with all his fellow men. In turn, an object for others, he is nothing more than an individual in the collectivity upon which he depends. So this whole quote is sort of Beauvoir's orientation to, again, the sort of paradox or ambiguity of both our ontology, like our existence, and also our lived experience. So she's trying to articulate how we are, again, both, and how things are sort of happening simultaneously. So what I have done, or what I have been working on in the past, was to try to connect intersectionality with ambiguity. So thinking about intersectionality as a Black feminist framework and ambiguity as a phenomenological framework. I tried to, and I have a reference from my article here, I was wanting to see how one could add to the other. So like how ambiguity allows us to see intersectionality in a certain way, and how intersectionality related to ambiguity allows us to see ambiguity in a certain way. So when I originally proposed this, I thought one way that ambiguity allows us or helps us see intersectionality is that it describes it as both descriptive and normative. It has already an existential sort of methodology. So Beauvoir is already recognized. It mentions and it talks about the connection between the collective and the individual. And also it highlights the notion of oppositional identity. So those were highlighted in the Black feminist premises. On the other hand, we see sort of what intersectionality or what sort of ambiguity can do to intersectionality is to rectify some of the erasure of Black women, women of color in the history of philosophy, to open up or broaden the concern of phenomenology, to deal with particularity and situatedness, and also just to think about what is philosophy. I'm very often thinking, what is philosophy? What is considered philosophy? Who is considered the subject of philosophy? So one of the things that I think putting them together does is allows us to broaden both of them. So ultimately, my question is right now, is there a possibility for a Black feminist phenomenology? So bringing together all of those frameworks, and my question is, what would a Black feminist phenomenology offer, right? So not just going back to Paget Henry, an Africana phenomenology or an Africana and gender phenomenology, but a Black feminist phenomenology that takes up the concerns of Black feminism. And my question is, I mean, I'm not sure that there's any merit in doing this. I'm not sold on whether or not we should, but I'm interested in, does it offer anything? And then additionally, would it specifically open up more space for solidarity and coalition? Does it do anything to help us achieve the aims of critical phenomenology to come together and to change, the world? So that's the setup. And now I'm finally going to get specific. So going back to Audre Lorde, one specific text of hers written in 1980 is the Cancer Journals. So the Cancer Journals is her account of her diagnosis of the breast cancer diagnosis, and going through the process of her double mastectomy, healing from it, and talking about how it changed her orientation to the world. So she is asking here in this text, how do I give voice to my quest so that other women can take what they need from my experiences? How do my experiences with cancer fit into the larger tapestry of my work as a Black woman, into the history of all women? And most of all, how do I fight the despair born of fear and anger and powerlessness, which is my greatest internal enemy? So in reading the Cancer Journals, I thought, oh, this actually feels like a phenomenological text. It feels like phenomenology, because she's doing not only sort of essay and argumentative work, she's doing some journal work, she's doing deep, deep description of this experience. And it feels to me, again, also that it engages in the project of healing. She's interested in healing, right? So how do I use the description of my life in order to help others? How do I use understanding of myself, my own particularities, in order to give something to other people that they can take away? And so when I began to read this, something that stood out to me was the concept of the tapestry. So she mentions this word tapestry, into the larger tapestry of my work as a Black woman. So then she begins, actually, the Cancer Journals, with this quote, which also got me to thinking. So each woman responds to the crisis that breast cancer brings to her life out of a whole pattern, which is the design of who she is and how her life has been lived. So again, for me, I'm interested in first tapestry, and then we have come up pattern, the notion of the pattern. How is this kind of being drawn to this fabric metaphor, the pattern, the tapestry, the thread? So she begins by sort of asking this question about, how can my experience be related to the whole pattern? and generally that women's lives, she's proposing that women's lives, that we respond from the building of our pattern, the design of who we are and how our lives have been lived. And the next quote, she says, the weave of every woman's everyday existence is a training ground for how she handles crisis. So again, the fabric, the weave of each woman's everyday existence as the training ground, the preparation for how she handles crisis, how she understands, you know, fighting against racism, sexism, etc. And another longer quote, we're just going to read sort of this again, and I'll show you. This is directly from her journal. It is such an effort to find decent food in this place, not just to give up and eat the old poison, but I must tend to my body with as much care as I tend the compost, particularly now when it seems so beside the point. Is this pain and despair that's around me a result of the cancer, or has it just been released by cancer? I feel so unequal to what I always handled before, the abominations outside that echo the pain within. And yes, I am completely self-referenced right now because it is the only translation I can trust. And I do believe not until every woman traces her weave back, strand by bloody self-reference strand, will we begin to alter the whole pattern. So this quote is so rich to me. I could go on for days and days and days about what's in here. But for me now, I will highlight a few things. One is very clearly the notion of the pattern, right? So it comes in here and she talks about the weave, right? So how the weave. But something that she adds here is to think about the weave as being threaded, that there's self-reference threads, that there are threads that we can identify, that something useful about the weave, the fabric, the pattern, is to think about how the threads can lead us to our own sort of self-reference. And I think this idea of self-reference and self-translation, which is I am the only translation I can trust, right? I am the only translation I can trust. But then she also says the abominations outside that echo the pain within. So there's some connection between my self-reference, my tracing my threads, right? And what's happening on the outside. And additionally, I love that she calls the threads bloody, that they're bloody threads. Not only because it's, you know, sort of feminist, but because it's also embodied. It also adds to it, right? Not only that I have lived, embodied all of these threads, right? But also some of these threads are traumatic, some of them are violent, some of them are, you know, so until we can trace those threads, we cannot figure out what the pattern was, right? But once we figure out what those threads are, we can alter the pattern, she says. We can go on to alter the pattern. So what I think she's sort of offering us here is a potential usefulness of Black, we take this as a phenomenological metaphor that's useful. What can it do, right? So one thing that allows us to do is to acknowledge the fabric. So she's calling the experience the fabric, right? So this is we come out of the fabric. Two, once we can acknowledge that there is fabric, we can look for patterns, right? Identify the patterns. What are the patterns on the fabric? And in order to do that, or so part of the way that we do that is by delineating the threads, right? By tracing the self-reference threads back, right? So that we can change. I have more to say, I think, about this pattern thing. So fabric has a pattern, and that pattern indicates how the threads have been weaved together. So I take this to mean that there is a way we can look at the conditions that produce our lives, like sexism, racism, capitalism, etc., and identify them. So we can think of the pattern as being composed of threads. And these threads, for Lord, are our own experiences and the ways that these conditions have affected our own lives. This is where self-translation and self-reference come in, and we use these processes again to identify our bloody threads. We also can note here that the fabric cannot exist without the threads. So this thing about the collective and the individual, the fabric and one's own experience and how that experience is connected to the larger experience. The fabric is composed of threads, but each thread can only be understood as a part of the pattern or the fabric in relation to the other threads. So in this metaphor, we each have our own experiences, but those experiences exist in sort of ambiguous relation to experiences of the collective, and we're always already both and, right? So I think, again, that there's something kind of useful here, and I'm thinking, again, back to intersectionality, wanting to think about commonalities. When I started to look at the weave, the thread, the pattern in Audre Lorde, I wanted to look for it in other women of color feminists. One way or connection that I thought that I want to bring back was the notion of interlocking oppression, which is connected to intersectionality in some sort of historically. So this comes from the Combahee River Collective in 1977. So the most general statement of our politics at the present time would be that we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that our major systems of oppression are interlocking. The synthesis, of these oppressions create the conditions of our lives. So interlocking. Someone who is also thinking about interlocking, and also I'm considering as a feminist phenomenologist, is Maria Lugones. And so Maria Lugones particularly, I started to read her because she talks about ambiguity. So she sort of led me to another aspect or dimension of ambiguity. And she has a criticism of intersectionality. She thinks that intersectionality, because of this traffic metaphor, it's not consistent, right? It's still saying that there is this system and there is this system, and they intersect. Lugones wants us to move toward, and this is early Lugones, so when she becomes moves more into decolonial feminism, this is before her sort of decolonial feminist turn. So in this, this is particularly from Pilgrimages, she's talking about how can we not use intersectionality, but still retain the concept of interlocking. She says we should talk about mesh, we should talk about intermeshing. And one of the things that, and she put this actually in a footnote where she's critiquing intersectionality and intermeshing. And she offers something that I thought was, interesting and perhaps a commonality. And if anyone knows or has anything of interest to share or think about this, I just found it very provocative as a linkage. So trama, tramar, tramoyar, the triple wordplay is intended to trouble the distinction and separation between making and its product. And it emphasizes the devious quality of the making. A trama, the weave of a piece of cloth, that is tramara, plaited, is one whose weave cannot be understood apart from plaiting. So tramoyar, a Lunfardo word, and this is Argentinian, marks a devious concocting that takes advantage of disguises provided by ordinary expectation. So obviously here, the notion of the weave, and there's not much on this. Again, it appears in a footnote, but that she is proposing this notion of the weave of the fabric as a way to think about, I think, intersectionality. She's still interested in that. So it led me to think, is there, some kind of way in which this is a woman of color's phenomenological metaphor? Like, what are the possibilities of this metaphor to give us, something useful for achieving the kind of aims that we were talking about? And in other places, Lugones goes on to talk about sort of the weave in the fabric or a pattern. In her essay, Purity and Separation, as we come to understand curdling as resisting domination, we also need to recognize its potential to germinate a non-oppressive pattern, a mestiza consciousness, una conciencia mestiza. So how it can germinate a new pattern, right? A new something in the connected to Audre Lorde, a new fabric, a new weave. So I'm gonna just wax poetic a little bit more about fabric and weaves while we look at that. So I'm pointing also back here to the mesh, because how the threads come together to form a pattern in the fabric. And that pattern cannot be understood without the intermeshedness, the trama, the weave. I'm identifying this as a useful, potentially Black feminist phenomenological metaphor, and one that can connect women of color feminisms, or maybe could potentially connect women of color feminisms. And I also think it links back to ambiguity, because ambiguity encapsulates the both and. Ambiguity allows us to see potentially the strength of this metaphor, because we can only understand this as a metaphor, really its existence, its composition, and its usefulness if we attend to the notion of ambiguity. So we must be able to see both and as Lubona, I think, helps really usefully suggest that we have to develop the capacity to see, to tolerate paradox, contradiction, right? I've been looking for connections because I can speak about Black women in the United States, and I can speak about Black feminisms from the United States, both the history and I think what's happening contemporarily. So if you have questions, but I can't speak to your experiences. I can't speak to Mexican women's experiences. So my sense, though, what I take from Audre Lorde and these philosophers is that if I clarify, or this metaphor, that if I clarify my own experience, if I trace my threads, then I can learn something about how our threads are interconnected. So if I trace my threads and you trace your threads, we can learn how we're connected together in this sort of weave, how we can mesh together, and then again, how we can alter or change the pattern. Because my sense is that even though we have sort of these different experiences, we want to create a new pattern, right? We're interested in creating something new. And I think our sense of what something new is very much connected. So I have been thinking about my experience here and some of the places that I've been to with you, and trying to, I just want to now open up space to think about some of the things that I've offered, and also to think about, for us to think about, if possible, the connections and the differences from what I've explained of Black feminism and Black feminist concerns. So I've just sort of put together some things that I've observed and wonder about. So started here by going to this exhibit that is in Casa Lago. I don't know, is it still up? Yes. Yeah. So you all should go and see it. It's a wonderful exhibit about feminism, right? So the history of feminist activism. And one of the things that I was really struck by, particularly in this exhibit, is thinking, I wasn't used to seeing so many women, intergenerationality. So one of the things that I saw as a difference in the, at least political protests, women of all ages, right? So something about sort of the notion of investment in the fabric being multi-generational that I don't see as explicitly, I think, in sort of Black feminist activism. It also made me think of, so one of the photographers who's featured here is Ana Victoria Jimenez, who is a friend of yours, and this is also you. But I also love this picture because it illustrates the sort of like intergenerationality, right? So she, you know, as a feminist photographer, and then us doing our work and looking at her work and thinking about her work seems also to me to be something special, something special. Also had the opportunity to attend the march on Tuesday, so the March 8th march. And one of the other things that I've been thinking about is about diversity, not just of age, but also of orientation, political orientation. So one of the things that struck me at the march were how we have sort of radical anarchist feminists and then other feminists who have different orientations, but they're all here together. And I think one of the reasons of all being here together is the notion of the immediacy of violence, the immediacy of sort of gendered violence that seems to suggest, even if we have this orientation and this orientation and this orientation, at the end of the day, we show up together because the circumstances, we have to do something, right? We have to do something immediately. Again, sort of also thinking just about kind of like the differences, like what these sort of protest signs and what they seem to illustrate about maybe also the tension in the feminist movement here. Maybe that's like but also to me, it seemed ambiguous, right? Of course, right? Like a both and happening at the same time. Also, I would love for you all to tell me more about the things that are happening at the university, right? So there seems also to be a sense of, the sense of immediacy causes it appears to me more radical activism, more willingness to speak to power, or speak to authority. I've also been thinking about the sort of things that we have in place kind of culturally. So for instance, the women's only trains, these don't, to my knowledge, exist anywhere in the United States, right? So thinking about what that means about the pattern, the fabric of your lives, what that means about how you think to orient or to change the pattern. One of the other things I've been thinking about is the category, the notion of femicide. We have no such category in the United States. What does the notion of that category say?
Which notion, sorry?
The femicide. Yeah. The notion of this category to, what does it say about the pattern, right? What does it say about the strand, or what does it say about, what does it say about the activism here? How the lives, how your lives produce particular points or activism, and femicide being one of these things. So I wanted to just sort of go back as I'm turning this back over to you, is to look back at these Black feminist premises. So I'm gonna ask you to maybe discuss among yourselves, and maybe we'll come back, or to write down, to think about what are the distinctions? So where are points of connection, right? So what are the commonalities when you look at this as a framework of Black feminism? What do you identify with? What don't you identify with? And so then what are the commonalities and what are the differences? And just to reiterate, she begins by saying it's not monolithic. So I'm not proposing that your feminism is monolithic, right? But rather that I'm interested in sort of what are the commonalities, what are things sort of generally that you might be able to say from your sort of account of feminism. So I've been thinking, so I'm closing up now, and I'm again sort of like turning it back to you, but I wanted to think back to the question of solidarity. So one of the other things that seems to me is, and I was working on this presentation and also watching we went to Frida Kahlo Museum, thinking about Frida Kahlo as an example of a person doing sort of self-referential work, their self-reference, literally like bloody pattern tracing. And so I was gonna ask, like, who is doing that kind of work? Like, who do you think is doing that kind of work? While I was sitting there thinking, like, I can't think of anyone. So there's one person, but I'm interested if there are other figures, or because it seems to me that the immediacy that I'm talking about seems to be less focused on the self-reference, less focused on the on what I'm proposing, this pattern tracing. So I'm wondering why, how. I'm wondering if it's interesting. I'm wondering how the circumstances make that the case, because I think this concern with self-reference is not just Audre Lorde. We can see it in Bell Hooks. We can see it in, I think it's really a Black feminist concern. So I'm wondering how that works. Does it actually do the work that I'm proposing or suggesting that it does? So I've been mostly frustrated with myself, again, and thank you all so much for sitting here and listening to me. I've been frustrated with myself about thinking about solidarity and thinking about coalition, like just thinking about it, and because of my language, not being able to talk, or because of the amount of time I have, not being able to build trust with feminist communities. So I've been feeling very like I have failed in some way to be here. But I had thought, like, how am I building coalition? How am I contributing to this? And I did think about at the march, there were moments where we had to duck and run and be together and be physically embodied, that our protection, was related to one another, right? So I was thinking, like, when we're sort of engaging, thinking about solidarity, there's something about being embodied together. And I felt in that sense, that sort of immediacy pulled us together, that there is some way that coalition can happen even when we don't know it's happening, right? You can be doing it even when you're not thinking about doing it. And so again, thank you so much to you and to this group of professors and friends that you've allowed me to be a part of. Also, I really love this picture of you with your students. I mean, it's just, I am very much appreciative of the opportunity to think about this. And another sort of piece from the exhibit that you should go to at Casa Largo, is thinking about, again, coalition. There have been times where we come together to talk about our common experiences, and we have the opportunity to do that still in the future. And I'm grateful for my having the opportunity to do that. And I hope to open up discussion for us to think about that. So that's it.